The Dagon says to behold their might and tremble as George says to have at thee before causing 3 cuts upon their face. Ben says that's gonna leave a mark as Gwen shows up with Ship while she was wearing her armor set just to be safe. Ben asked if she found anything, and she says that she didn't. They were attacked before she could find anything. George says that if they cannot seal the dragon, then they must slay them instead. Ben nods in response to that as the Dagon then calls for Vilgax to destroy them, but not getting an answer. Ben then laughs at Dagon, telling him Vilgax is only out to serve his own personal goals. What he wants doesn't apply. The Esoterica begin to fight them instead, with Dagon firing energy blasts from his eyes in response to having to fight for himself. We cut to Siphon working on something, saying that most of the prep work was already done on the way there. They just needed to complete the finishing touches, and that pleases Vilgax to hear. They all continue to fight, with Ben helping George fight off the Esoterica as the Ultimatrix had timed out and needed to cool down, but we see that he was still proficient in hand-to-hand combat and dangerous with his plumber's staff and plasma blade respectively, as they'd cleared them away from the night enough to allow them to move freely in their strikes without restraint movement. Dagon grows angry and calls out that that was enough and started creating clouds around themselves, telling George not to fear the clouds, but the lightning. Realizing what he was doing, George threw his sword to Ben and called out to Gwen to put up a barrier around herself and her friends, now! Then tells Ben that with his final breath he bequeaths Ascalon to him. Finish the mission. Red lightning then struck the knight where he stood, returning him to his frail old body and making him collapse onto his knees as he began to turn to dust and slowly blow away into the wind. Dagon says that all that defy him will meet the same fate, and Vilgax says that he begs to differ and he challenges the Dagon to strike him down if he can. Dagon then fires energy rays at Vilgax, but he sidesteps and they hit the machine that Siphon was standing at the controls of, and he says that he cannot stop. Siphon then explains that the device draws in power, and since that's all Dagon is, well, bad day to be them, it would seem, with a twisted sort of smirk on his face. Ben says he saw that coming as Siphon then blasted Vilgax with the machine, giving all of Dagon's powers to him. They see Vilgax as a giant floating tentacle face, and Gwen says that she thought he couldn't get any uglier, making Ben laugh in response to her statement about his looks, though honestly he'd have to agree with her about that. Vilgax says that he will give Ben a chance to save his world more out of the entertainment value that it would bring him than actually caring, however, and asks just what he was going to do to save it. Ben then tells him he knows exactly what he'll do to save it, holding up the Ultimatrix to the sword as the blank spot upon the hilt began glowing and took on the look of the Ultimatrix symbol, with the hilt turning green. Ben then focuses Ascalon's power as it began to warp around him, creating a chainmail armor before wrapping him in an armored tunic that was black and green in color with a tribal pattern, that of a symbol that his grandmother Verdona had showed him during one of her visits. He'd also taken on armored pants and boots as well. Vilgax looks surprised with Ben's armor being drastically different than that of Sir George. Ben asks Vilgax if he's ready for this as his eyes began glowing with a green flame that burst from them, giving him a whole new appearance. His usual attitude had changed a bit, and he'd seemed a bit cocky, like this was a game to him instead of it being dangerous, with everyone's lives at stake. Gwen told Ship to record everything, and Ship barked in response, watching the whole thing play out. Vilgax takes on a monstrously sized bipedal form, telling Ben that he was going to destroy them, and our hero tells him good luck with that as he swings the blade, creating energy projectiles that slashed at him, before hitting the Ultimatrix and changing into Diamond Head, who'd changed to looks, appearing more like it had a glowing neon green paint inside the crystal, making it glow, as he'd punched Vilgax in the face and knocking him stumbling back slightly. Hitting the Ultimatrix again, he changed into Cannonbolt, whose shell had become green with small bump bits on the back, as he'd slammed into him while he was stumbling, knocking the tyrants back further. Our hero asked if they were having fun yet, changing back into human as we see a green-colored streak had appeared in his hair, and he had a cheeky grin on his face, his eyes still glowing aflame. Our warlord then says that he's grown weary of Ben's games. It's time to get serious, to which our hero then shrugs and says if he says says so, and hits the Ultimatrix, changing into Way-Big, whose red bits had become green and serrated like that of a saw blade, as the blade Ascalon had grown along with them, and they held it at the ready. Ben then calls out to Vilgax, stating that, as George would say, "Have at thee!" Before charging at them, Vilgax then starts to fire energy attacks at Ben, but he just kept cutting through them, or knocking them away. He then crossed his arms and fired an energy attack of his own, blowing away most of the orbs, before continuing on the attack. Getting up close, Ben slashes Vilgax's arm with his serrated arm blade, cutting it off before kicking him away, and stabbing the severed piece with his sword, absorbing it into the blade. The tyrant grew angry, regrowing his lost limb, and charged up a rather large blast, one that he was sure the normal Way-Big wouldn't be able to handle, that's for certain. Hitting the Ultimatrix symbol, Ben changed into Ultimate Way-Big and focuses the blade of Ascalon, as the straight double-edged blade extended slightly and became slightly thinner, with the sword's guard extending spikes out. He was now at the ready for the attack to come. The two stared one another down, waiting for their moment to strike. When Vilgax threw his giant sphere, Ultimate Way-Big threw the blade of Ascalon outwards in front of him before jumping up and kicking it with the bottom of his foot, and began to charge up his cosmic beam, firing just as Ascalon was about to hit the energy attack that Vilgax had built up, causing it to puncture, and he ran forward, diving into the puncture point as the blast flew off into the air and out into space somewhere. Ben then blasted Vilgax as he was about to make a grab for Ascalon, knocking him away and giving him the chance to retrieve the sword, as he began hacking and slashing away at Vilgax, slowly draining the power of Dagon from his form. He'd continued doing this until there was barely anything left, then returned to his human state, showing half of his hair had become green, and the marking on his shirt had now appeared on his right shoulder. He then applies the finishing blow, fully draining Vilgax of Dagon's powers once and for all. The tyrant tells Ben that he has the Ultimatrix, the sword of Ascalon, and the power of Dagon at his fingertips. He could do anything he wanted with that kind of power. He could wipe out all evil with that kind of power, and all it would take is one simple thought. Ben then smirks hearing that, starting to worry Gwen, as he'd been acting strange since he got Ascalon. Gwen asked if he's really taking moral advice from Vilgax, and he turns to Gwen and smirks, giving her a silent wink. He then holds up the sword and lets out a burst of energy. After realizing he was still there, Vilgax asked what he'd done, and Ben says that he simply undone what Dagon and the Flamekeeper Circle had done to those living on Earth. It's not his place to decide what people should and shouldn't do. Gwen runs over and hugs Ben before kissing him, glad that he didn't listen to what Vilgax was saying. Ben then says that he needs to get Ascalon to Azimuth, though the Galvan First Thinker says that there is no need, as he is already there to retrieve it, before taking note of how different Ben had appeared, finding it strange, and started to do a scan on him with something he'd brought with him. Ben looks confused, with Ship barking and showing Azimuth the video feed of what happened to them, and Azimuth says that this is rather interesting, as Verdona showed up saying that she sensed an anodite on Earth. The First Thinker says that it seems to have been a fluke, taking the sword from Ben as he began to revert to normal. Verdona asked what he meant by that, and the Galvan responds that the power within Ascalon seems to have temporarily given Ben the ability to tap into his anodite heritage, and that they'd have to do more studies to find out more about just what all that was about, with Ben calling out that he didn't want to be studied. Azimuth apologizes to Ben and teleports the sword to only he knows where, as well as the Ultimatrix, saying that glitchy tool wasn't worthy of him. The new Omnitrix was ready. They also say that as per his request, he's starting over with a completely new playlist. Master Control has also been deactivated. He's starting over with a blank slate just as he wanted, though he did gift him a new powerhouse in case things got rough, and left in Alien X in case of life and death emergency. Verdona sears the tribal marking into Ben's flesh, making him grunt in pain, as she tells him though his powers were only tapped into temporarily, he's still shown that he has the potential for them, and that he truly is of the anodite lineage, and so she has gifted him with the mark of the men in their anodite side of the family.